Workers of Penderyn came down this tram road and came outside these ironworks and rose up the red flag. Their objective was to bring the workers out in revolt. They succeeded in doing this, and they sacrificed a lamb and made a red flag. This became the symbol of the 1831 insurrection of Merthyr, Aberdare and Irvine. They then from here marched on Merthyr, and on June the 2nd, reaching Merthyr, the revolt kicked off. Within days, soldiers are pouring into Merthyr, and on the evening of June the 3rd, 30 people, perhaps 70 people, were massacred by Scottish soldiers at the Castle Hotel. We are reenacting this event today. Bara nai waid, trech glad na carglwydd. Bara nai waid!
The spirit of Hirwaun Common, statement by the Great Unrest Group for a Welsh Socialist Republican Party. The Great Unrest Group for a Welsh Socialist Republican Party celebrates the Merthyr Uprising in 1831, a defining point in Welsh history when the Welsh working class in open rebellion announced itself on the world stage. The raising of the red flag in Hirwaun Common was a symbolic act of national and class defiance from the new Welsh working class. The red flag was the gift of the Welsh working class to the workers of the world, just as the workers in the United States, and in particular Chicago, have given the world's workers Day, May Day. Gifts of the working class struggle are the most precious, and the new generation needs to learn to honour them. We at the Great Unrest Group for a Welsh Socialist Republican Party seek the renewal of the spirit of Hirwaun Common in Wales in our ceremonial renewal of the rising of the red flag in the 21st century on the 1st of June 2013. We have messages of solidarity from England, from Brittany, from Aquitania, from Galicia in Spain, Italy, Iceland, Norway and the Philippines for our ceremony. Our ceremony is not only national but international, like the class we represent. We reject the supranational bourgeois cosmopolitanism, the ideology of global capitalism, for proletarian internationalism, the true friendship of peoples based on mutual respect for each other's struggles for national and social liberation. Let the message from Merthyr in 1831 ring across Wales and the world. We have a Wales to win. We have a world to win. Hold the red flag high beyond the reach of our enemies and false friends. The battle for the 21st century is just opening, and by rectifying our past mistakes, we will speed capitalism's demise. Socialism is the future. Its day is dawning as the 21st century progresses. Thank you.
Today is the 1st of June 2013. We're here at the Lamb Hotel in Penderyn to commemorate the Merthyr Rising of 1831, which took place between the 1st and 7th of June. Today, Alan Jones of the Great Unrest will make a commemoration speech on the Tarw Scotch. That's the Scotch cattle, the workers' organisation. Little is known about them participating in this revolt in 1831, but the Scotch cattle were active from 1822 in Gwent and in Aberdare, and we do know that many of the Aberdare workers supported this revolt, so it is possible that the Scotch cattle were involved as well. And after the revolt failed, the Scotch cattle became very active again in Gwent and very active right up until 1850 in Aberdare. Alan will now make this commemoration speech.
Thank you. The working class movement was not defeated in 1831. It did exactly what working class movements that suffer setbacks have done ever since 1831. It went underground. The Scotch cattle is an example of an underground working class movement that existed prior to 1831 and existed for many decades after underground. The origins of the Scotch cattle name have been lost, but several possible interpretations have been offered. Some of the disguises worn by the Scotch cattle were actually cowskins, and this alone may have provided the name. Alternatively, it may have meant to evoke the fierceness of certain breeds of actual Scottish cattle, such as the Highland cattle, or may have referred ironically to a herd of Scottish cattle owned by a local mine owner in the early 19th century. However, the Scotch cattle first appeared in the early 1820s in the Gwent valleys. The movement was formed by discontented workers, mainly from the local mines in the Gwent valleys. Their aims were to improve the pay and working conditions of the local workers, but their tactics were for direct action against any person or group who opposed their working class cause. They existed as a secret society, with its members swearing allegiance under pain of death to the Scotch cattle. Each valley, town and village had its own group, and a leader was elected, usually a person respected and feared for his physical strength, known as the Bull, or in Welsh the Tarw. Their meetings were always clandestine, being held at dark and in secret locations, usually on hillsides. Victims were usually workers who were blacklegged or refused to join the strike action, or workers who were prepared to work for less money, or informers. A warning would be issued to offenders. Failure to comply would invoke drastic consequences. Retribution was swift. Offenders were scotched, which involved a visit by the cattle, faces blackened and dressed in animal skins, with a tarrow, wearing a headdress bearing a bull's horns. Normally the punishment would be undertaken by a herd from another area to avoid recognition by local residents. The cattle's code, however, dictated that any foodstuffs found in the household would always be left intact. Company property was also targeted, and truck shops and other buildings ransacked and burnt down. Despite attempts by the authorities to penetrate the movement and bring ringleaders to book, their activities continued for 40 years, mainly due to the extreme secrecy of the organisation and the reluctance of the general public to speak against their actions. The movement was wrongly said to have died out after 1835, when one of its members, Edward Morgan, a coal miner, was framed for attempted murder and hanged at Monmouth Jail on the 6th of April 1835. Edward Morgan should be as famous in Wales as Dick Penderyn and Lewis, but has largely been written out of history. Our task at the Great Unrest Group is to bring him back and get him recognition as a leader of the Scotch cattle, fight for social justice, expressed in those days as natural justice. There is evidence that the Scotch cattle continued well into the 1850s in the Aberdare area. Aberdare, as much as Irvine and Merthyr, were revolutionary storm centres during the 1831 Merthyr Rising. The Scotch cattle revolt in Aberdare in both 1834 and 1850 both are hardly mentioned in the more popularly known historical references to the Scotch cattle of Gwent. It appears that representatives of the Aberdare Gadlist Works attended a meeting in Rumney on the 13th of June 1834. This was a genuine attempt at unionism and solidarity in struggle against the coal owners. However, it is obvious there will also be meetings with the Gwent Tarw Scotch as well. That summer and into the autumn there was some limited Scotch cattle activity in the Aberdare and Hirwine area. This was also very much a postscript to the 1831 revolt, which Getting Up Griffith has rightly called the Heads of the Valleys insurrection. During the following years, matters became quiet until the years 1840 to 1843, when the coal miners of Tredegar went on strike and those of Aberdare came out in sympathy. However, the strike failed largely due to the lack of unity with other pits who insisted on their own autonomy in right to negotiate and make deals with the mine owners. In the years that followed after the strike failure at the power pit had come back, unionism began to take root, and by 1849 a primitive union had been set up, and work stopped at the Gadlist pit in an attempt by the collies to secure certain rights regarding employment. As in 1831, in 1849 there was a huge gathering of 7,000 people on Hirwine Common, and the authorities, no doubt very mindful of 1831, began to draft in police and troops into the area. As the strike continued, bitterness began to rise amongst the workers and people in the area, not least against the blacklegs. Matters would turn more serious as the Scotch cattle rose up again, and this time more violently. A blackleg was fatally wounded with a black powder bomb that was thrown through a window of his bedroom. Further, 2 blacklegs were shot at. Funerals of other blacklegs were unceremoniously disturbed with rough music and demonstrations by anger of colliers and their families. An unusual incident during the strike was the excommunication of a blackleg by a local chapel for his refusal to go on strike. At that time it was usual for the non-conformist chapels to oppose strikes and unionism and secret oaths. The strike failed and the area settled down, and the outbreak of the Crimean War brought prosperity to the valleys of Wales, and of course with it the rise in British patriotism and a rush to the colours. However, it was not until the 1870s that trade unionism established itself widely across South Wales coalfield. Then the Lancashire-based Amalgamated Association of Miners built up a membership of 42,000 miners in South Wales. In two long and bitter disputes in 1871 and 1875, the Amalgamated Association of Miners was defeated. The defeat was partly due to the continuing hostility of coal owners to trade unions and also to blackleg labour that was imported into the coalfield to replace the strikers. What are the lessons of today? The Scotch cattle from the 1820s to the 1850s were a clandestine working class underground organisation that, unlike the Chartists, which included the middle classes, was not penetrated by police agents. The Scotch cattle took infiltration seriously, and it was well known that there would be serious consequences for any informers, hence their ability to survive for nearly 40 years in the valleys of Gwent, despite the attempts to penetrate them by the British state.
Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to Penderyn. It's a bit strange to be saying that because there's plenty of people here from Penderyn who should be saying that themselves, I think, but I'm sure you're very welcome here, and particularly at the Lamb Hotel. And we're here this morning, of course, to unveil the plaque to the Lamb Hotel. And the order of proceedings is that Councillor Doug Williams, Mayor of Wrthryfel, will be unveiling the plaque. Then we're going to make our way round into the garden, round the back here. Mr. Viv Pugh from the Dick Penderyn Society is going to give us a talk about the Merthyr Rising, about Lewis Lewis, who was incarcerated here, and the background and the history to that event. After that, the cellar is open here, which is the place where Lewis Lewis was incarcerated, so you are welcome to go and have a look, but what I would say is be careful because there are steep steps and only go a few at a time, okay? And of course we do have some refreshments available for you a little later on as well. So without further ado, I'll ask Councillor Doug Williams, Mayor of Wrthryfel, to unveil the plaque.
Thank you very much, John.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm chairman of the Dick Penderyn Society in Merthyr Tudfil. I'm not here today to talk about Dick Penderyn. I'm not really going to talk a great deal about the Merthyr Uprising. I'm going to talk about Lewis Lewis and his role in the uprising and why we should remember Lewis Lewis. Lewis Lewis really is a secondary sort of figure in the events of 1831. It's always Dick Penderyn that comes to the fore. And when people think of 1831, they always think of Dick Penderyn, not Lewis Lewis. So who is Lewis Lewis? What is he? What he stood for? Well, obviously, the best way to describe Lewis Lewis, he's a charismatic organiser of the 1831 uprising. He's a trade union man through and through, and his goal for that period of time is to get the trade union movement off. And the whole focus after 1831 was to crush the trade union movement, which had taken off in England, but was still very, very slow in Wales, and would be for several decades afterwards. Excuse me while I refer to my notes. Penderyn in 1831 was a parish of 1,385 people. It looked, in all intents, as if you visit it, and particularly to the foreign English visitors that came in, as a very rural, peaceful place. Of course, it was largely industrial. People worked in industry, Aberdare, Herwine, or went over to Merthyr. And of course, what you must remember, when you read about Merthyr at the time, they're not actually referring to the place now known as Merthyr Town or Merthyr Borough. They're actually referring to Merthyr, Aberdare, Herwine, Penyderyn, and the surrounding areas. That is the Merthyr of the time. So Penyderyn, although it looks to the outside a small village, batted well above its size for the trade union movement and for the time. There are loads and loads of legends surrounding Lewis, like Dick Penderyn. I was once asked, would I produce a book of legends of Dick Penderyn? And I said he'd probably go from volume 1 to 20. Lewis is almost as bad. He is an enigma, like Dick Penderyn, but what facts we know about him are all centered around his involvement. One of the most quoted legends about him is he's an illegitimate son of the local gentry, the local squire. Totally inaccurate. His father, as far as we know, was like Dick Penderyn and haulier, dealing with the horses, getting the loads to the local ironworks. Welsh speaking, all his oratory was in Welsh, although he did speak English well enough to insult the army on frequent occasions during the uprising, and particularly an army captain. Unfortunately, all the writings we have about the 1831 uprising, whether it's about the uprising itself, Lewis, or Dick Penderyn, comes from the government side, and it is notoriously very biased. Then you could say it's even worse than what it is today, if that's possible. Tory press, no other press is around. If you weren't Tory, you didn't get published. What few papers there were around from London did circulate in the area, but very few and far between. So Lewis was out to start the trade unions off. He believed in social justice, and he believed the best way of getting social justice was through the trade union movement. Basically, he wanted better wages, what the people were. According to the government, they were on around about 18 shillings and sixpence a week. But at the time of 1831, Lewis was supporting himself, his wife, and his children 8 shillings a week. Even if he was on the top wage of 18 and 6, that has still been a lower wage than what it had been 20 years previously. So obviously they wanted better wages, better living conditions. What we would term as a slum today would probably mean a palace as far as the Merthyr area was concerned. Worked very, very long hours, 7 days a week, 12 to 15 hours shifts. And don't forget, it's not only the men, it's the women who were the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, and of course the children. Children worked because they were part of the economic unit of the family. If you read trendy history books today, they say, oh well, the ironmasters were humanitarians. They allowed the women to work and they allowed the children. They didn't believe in splitting the family up. Of course, the reason why they employed the children, they were so cheap. Come to the actual uprising, when the workers took control of the town, Crawshed fobbed them off for several days, saying, yes, we'll negotiate with you, we'll sit down, we'll talk, and all the time he was frantically writing letters off to anybody who listened to him, get the army in from Brecon, get the army in from England. For the first time in British history, the English Imperial Army was stopped at the top of Kevin from getting to Merthyr and stopped right at the bottom of town from getting to Merthyr. So the so-called finest army in the world was stopped by a bunch of iron workers, largely female again, although you won't find that in many history books. So Lewis, what do we know about him? Well, apart from the very low wages, the testimony in the trials, again, today we'd say we'd kick him out of court, really, because a lot of the testimony was hearsay and not actual evidence. During disturbances in Thomas Llewellyn's house, Lewis is supposed to make threatening gestures towards the soldiers. Now, how an unarmed man can make threatening gestures to somebody pointing a huge bayonet and rifle at you, I don't know. But probably because the man looked threatening. He's supposed to, according to local legend, intervened when a local magistrate was being threatened by the crowd. He pushed the crowd back and got the magistrate out of the way. Now that little incident is supposed to later, many people have said, actually saved his life when he was condemned to death. According to another eyewitness, Lewis was present during the seizure of goods from the court of request and stood on his trunk, that's the trunk they'd taken from the house, and supervised the redistribution of goods from the court of request back to the original owners, the workers. Again, that's an eyewitness in the trial. Another eyewitness spots him outside the Castle Hotel next to the red flag. What they're trying to do is put Lewis, obviously, in the middle of the action. Donald Black, that's the soldier that was stabbed in the thigh, sees him pushing soldiers around the front of the inn. So Lewis twice threatened soldiers with a bayonet. Lewis is seen running with a musket in his hand, shouting to people, stand your ground, stand your ground. And he's redistributing guns with the crowd. Again, he's supposed to have jumped up on a wall, on a post, and spoke to the crowd in Welsh to get him to push the soldiers back. Again, this is eyewitness testament of the trial. They all perjured themselves, because none of them were anywhere near Lewis. After the trials, the Iron Masters, the Iron Masters circulated a letter laying the blame on the violent man of 1831. He was, of course, Lewis, the active trade union man, now hiding out in Kevin Coed. When Lewis was arrested on the 7th of June, the Iron Masters were convinced the ringleader and author of the trade union mischief would pay dearly for his crimes. Now, the whole focus of the government is to crush the trade union movement. And when they're talking about the uprising in 1831, they're not talking about the workers controlling the town or the workers demanding better living conditions, better pay. They are talking about the trade union movement in Merthyr must be crushed. And all through the early correspondence, this comes out time and time again. The trade unions have organised the uprising. Of course, they all wanted Lewis to pay dearly for his crimes. What were the charges against Lewis? Well, very similar to Dick Penderyn. The evidence, if you actually read the transcripts of the trials, which are available, I don't know if you can get them in Aberdare Library, but you can certainly get them in Merthyr Library. The evidence against Lewis was very weak. Minor charges were brought against him, very flimsy. A few of them were dismissed. Although the two major charges were ransacking Thomas Llewellyn's house, which is a capital charge, and of course aiding and abetting in the stabbing of Donald Black. And of course, wounding a soldier was regarded as an attack on the king's person, so it was a capital offence. throughout the whole of the period of the trial, you do get the impression the authorities are getting the names mixed up between Lewis and Richard Lewis, aka Dick Penderyn, constantly. I mean, it doesn't help with the fathers being Lewis as well, but as I say, great confusion. Most of the judges' submissions are spent on Lewis, talking about his attack on Thomas Llewellyn's house, which was the only charge he was actually found guilty of. But then the judge remarkably starts bringing up charges that were never mentioned at all during the trial. Obviously, they're out to get Lewis, the trade union organiser. As I say, many of these charges were not heard in court. Lewis was the marked man. The jury, even when the sentences were passed, the jury did plead with the judge for clemency, but the government were out to stamp the trade union movement and the ringleaders had to hang. Lewis and Dick Penderyn were sentenced to hang. Obviously, as you know, Dick Penderyn was the only one that was hanged. Lewis was transported. He sailed on the ship John on the 26th of January 1832. Rumour states that he did return for the opening of the Tudfil railway. However, highly doubtful, because all the official records are still in Australia. He's definitely working on a farm in in New South Wales in 1837. Reading again the trial, one comes up with the obvious conclusion: his life was spared because of his reactions in saving the life of the special constable. On a curious note, when I read the book recently for about the 10th or 12th time, the actual special constable that spoke up for Lewis hated Abbott, the special constable whose testimony put Dick Penderyn away. So you sometimes wonder, did he come forward to save Lewis's life, or did he come forward just to get one over on Abbott? And of course, as you know, Abbott and his family had to flee Merthyr after the uprising, although for several months the family was guarded in Cyfarthfa Castle. But Abbott fled for 5 or 6 years before he came back. So really, why are we here today? Why are we unveiling a plaque to a man that was active in the area in the 1830s? Again, Lewis, like Dick Penderyn, it's not the man we celebrate, it's his deeds. So what's the legacy for Lewis? Why are we here today? Well, after 1831, because of the work of Lewis and the men of Penderyn, and more emphasised because of the women of Penderyn, we see an alliance between working class and middle class radicals for the first time in Wales in this area. We see a Welsh language press take off in a few years in Merthyr. We see a Welsh radical press in English, a Chartist press. Okay, it only ran for a few editions, but it did run. 1831 to 1840, we see the birth of the Chartist movement. Now, the Chartist movement, in my opinion, would never have taken off in Wales if it wasn't for 1831, because 1831 laid down the ground rules. The trade union movement votes for all. As I say, the birth of the Welsh trade union movement was one of the legacies, although for a decade or more, comparing to England, it was very, very slow and steady, almost on a subterranean level. The red flag, the symbol of liberty, was raised first time in modern history. I've got to say that because I often tell my pupils the red flag originated with the ancient Welsh, because when they used to decapitate the Roman soldiers, they wrapped them in red cloth. And to bring it up to date, the brewery down the road, Penderyn, is going to be, in the next couple of months, bringing out whiskey called Red Flag. Another legacy of 1831, the continuation of radical politics. The leaders of 1831 were the leaders of the Chartist movement. were the leaders electing Henry Richard in 1868, a continuity, the uprising, Chartism, liberalism of 1868, all the way up to the ILP and Kay Hardy. To sum up really on Lewis Lewis, the world is a better place because of Lewis Lewis and the men from Penderyn who believed in social justice for all, a decent pay for a decent day's work, not 15 hours but 8-hour days, living in healthy homes that didn't have leaky roofs, and the right to vote. The true legacy of Lewis Lewis today is the political and civil liberties which protect us. Lewis Lewis was at the vanguard of this movement. Many of our great-great-grandparents paid the ultimate price and are now forgotten. Please remember Lewis Lewis and the men of Penderyn. Thank you very much.
Have you been down?
No, we're going to...
Can we pass you to go down?
Yeah.
All of them was coming to meet each other. But it was full of rubble and I wanted it cleaned up because where exactly are you from? Pontypridd itself.
Tomorrow is the 13th of August. That's the anniversary of the execution of Dick Penderyn in Cardiff. Today, the 12th of August, a ceremony of commemoration is being held here to mark where he was buried in St Mary's Church, Port Talbot. We are representing Cymdeithas Lewsyn ar Heliwr, who was transported to Australia for his part in the Merthyr insurrection. We are of the Great Unrest Group, 2012.
Mae'n dywych fel y beth. Dic Penderyn, redwch nawr, mae'r milwyr ar dy hon. Cotche coch, gwyniau gwyn, sydd i bobl ffôn.